Heat shimmer sat on the berm like a mirage, turning the desert into a wavering sheet of glass. The rifle lay across Alan Palmer's lap like an odd island, its stock lacquered a bright, improbable orange that did not belong under a pale, scorched sun. Around him, young Marines shuffled and snickered. The sound of their amusement was sharp in the thin air. Someone whistled a low, careless tune, and the rifle, so quietly unassuming, seemed to wait. If you value veteran stories, stay to the end, subscribe, and like. There's more coming. They were at Echo Range, a strip of hard-packed earth and steel silhouettes out beyond the training fences, where the berm rose and fell against targets lined like an anonymous city on the horizon. Gunning Miller had her clipboard balanced on one hip, her face a map of decisions and old loyalties. Corporal Evans leaned forward on a folding shooting stool, elbows splayed, voice strung taut with showmanship. Around them, 6 other Marines whispered, their laughter sticky with the confidence of youth. "You expectin' it to bark confetti?" Evans said. He tapped the orange stock with a thumb. "Looks like someone's repainting their kid's toy." Alan Palmer had been quiet all morning, as he had been quiet for decades. He was not the sort who rose to meet insults. His silence had the shape of a policy. His knuckles were pale where they gripped the stock. The orange finish was not paint. Those who leaned close could see the faint fingerprints, the nick in the wood near the sling swivel where a cautious hand had once set it down on the deck of a transport. The rifle had a name, in the half-imagined circles that still spoke of such things, Mark V. To most of these Marines, it was a curiosity. To Miller, it was a relic. To Palmer, it was memory in a shape he could still hold. "Sir," Miller said without ceremony, "that's enough." Evans straightened, grin still too wide. "Heard the story already, Gunny. Old-timer's got a trophy rifle. Maybe he's a collector." Miller did not look at Palmer as if he were a curiosity. Her eyes were the particular kind of watchful that had once kept fire teams together. "This range has rules. You come in, you've got to show credentials. We check with base admin." Palmer reached into his field jacket with a slow, practiced motion and withdrew a laminated access card. The edge of it caught the sun and sent a thin, clinical flash across cement and dust. It bore dates, stamps, a unit insignia, an old signature that had been revalidated more than once. He set it on the clipboard where Miller could see it, and for the first time a small fissure opened in the group's amusement. Evans tapped the card as though to knock it out of the path of seriousness. "That's not worth the paper it's printed on," he said. He laughed, others followed him, the sound like dry leaves. Miller's jaw tightened. "Call it in, Corporal." Evans' fingers found his radio, and the shift changed from amused to procedural. The chain moved along the belt line. Lieutenant Harris in logistics, Colonel Price at Range Command, a curt voice in the operations center who spoke in indexes and then in the language of names. Each call tightened a noose of attention. Each relay folded the little incident into the ledger of the base. The Marines who had been joking were suddenly quiet as a map. Palmer watched them with a patience that smoothed his features. His mouth was a thin line. It had not been designed for speeches. When he did speak, his words were precise, pared down, as if from a life in which every sentence had been assigned weight. "I come out to check the mark," he said finally. There was no apology in it. "I come to remember." For a moment, Evans' smirk reassembled itself. "You come to remember, or you come to show off? This is a live range. Protocols?" "Protocols why lives don't end in the dirt," Miller said. She kept her volume low, but the authority in it cleared the air. "You don't get to make a joke about someone who shows up with his credentials. Not on my watch." The radio hissed, then crackled into someone else's voice. An order about an ID check, a confirmation, the kind of language that read like legal paper by flashlight.
Lieutenant Harris drove his sedan onto the access road, tires raising a rooster tail of dust that ran like a promise toward the range. Colonel Price's sedan followed. Then, further out, a long line of armored SUVs pushed along the service road, a convoy that blurred the horizon into smoke. Engines grew into a low, approaching roar. The mood shifted. Conversations thinned. The Marines who had been bold enough to mock now folded into themselves like small flags furled against a wind. The desert did the rest of the work. Sound travels strangely in it, and authority arrives there with a certain theological gravity. Palmer's past did not open up all at once. He carried his memories like a seam in the chest, a thread that would be pulled by the right thumb, releasing cloth. When he closed his eyes briefly, the dry heat of this place summoned an old smell, not of gunpowder, but of machine oil and damp canvas. He saw a younger version of himself crouched under the belly of a transport plane with a flashlight between his teeth, hands blackened with grease. He heard another sound, not the whistle of taunts, but the distant, soft staccato of mortar thumps, a rhythm that had a name in his muscles. He tasted dust and coffee and the metallic edge of fear. These flashes did not make him large. They simply kept him company. Evans paced, the swagger now a defensive tactic. "So what's the problem?" he asked aloud, as if the problem was a stain that could be rubbed away. Old man shows up with a rifle, unconventional look, and everyone loses their minds. "You're testing me," Miller said. "You're testing everything we teach. You're about to be corrected in front of your men. You can turn that into learning, or you can make it into performance."
The convoy rolled in like a small tide. The SUVs kicked up dust that hung in the air and clung to uniforms. In the vehicles were officers who moved with the economy of rank. Colonel Price stepped out, hands flat on the roof for balance, his face set in the official hardness of command. He wore the expression of someone who had learned to make decisions when they were not liked. Behind him, Lieutenant Harris looked younger than his rank and more tired than his years should have allowed. A helicopter thudded briefly over the ridge, a sound that made the dust crouch in its path. Then the convoy stopped, engines idling like a congregation listening for a hymn. Brigadier General Marcus emerged last, purposeful and tall, a hand brushing dust from a sleeve as if to remove any impression of willingness to be drawn into pettiness. She had a reputation that preceded her. It traveled ahead of her in the base's corridors, and with the reputation came a kind of patient ferocity. When she approached, the sniggering ceased entirely. She looked at Palmer for a long, flat second. Where her gaze landed, the air felt thinner, as if truth itself had been asked to stand to attention. "Mr. Palmer," she said, with a voice that carried the minimal warmth of someone who had seen too many things she could not change but would not let slide. "You know we require proper checks." He nodded. "I know." Her eyes flicked to the orange stock and then back to him. It was painted at the request of the unit," Palmer said. His words were steady. "Visibility. They wanted to be seen. Made it brighter if they had to mark a faller in scrub. It became an identifier, not for parade." The general made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sigh. "That's not why we're here." A hush settled, full of the kind of waiting that is like the moment when a story tilts toward its true center. The young Marines had their ranks written in the tautness of their jaws. Evans' face was a portrait of someone who had to compute humiliation against pride, and the calculation cleaved at him. "Bring the rifle to the table," Marcus said. Palmer set it down with the care of a man who had spent years handling fragile things. Radios that had to be coaxed back into speech, field notes that had to be kept dry against rain. The wood made a small, final sound against the plastic table, a note that seemed undramatic until all eyes bent to catch it. Evans, who had reveled in mocking the object, now watched as if the rifle were the converging point of the day.
"Tell me about the Mark V," Marcus said, quietly, folding her hands behind her back. She invited him without commanding. Story. Palmer's jaw tightened. Saying anything meant opening a wound and risking that the wound would become spectacle. Yet his silence would be taken as arrogance. He let a memory stand up and speak for him, and as it did, the desert seemed to lean in. "It was a prototype," he said.
Developed in a small shop in '04. Not everything was military secret. Some of it was just stubborn men with more time than they had money. I put hours into it, because the engineer in me couldn't sleep until a stock fit a hand the way a house fits a family. We painted that one orange for visibility after a convoy took fire and somebody couldn't find the rifleman in the scrub. He was alive because they found him. The color stuck. He looked up, and for a breath the years folded. The rifle went with a pilot once, when the pilot's own gear failed. He used it to signal. It did what it needed to, once. We lost the pilot later, on a mission I won't recount here. He was not the brave kind of memory you put on a plaque. He was quiet. He drank coffee with his hands steady. He taught me how to be less afraid to be alive. The general's face was unreadable, but a faint inclination of respect crossed her. Miller's shoulders loosened minutely. The younger Marines swallowed like they were learning a new vocabulary, humility. Evan's mouth opened. "So that's why—" "It isn't a trophy," Palmer said. "It's a tool that held a life inside it. People attach stories to things when they can't keep the people themselves." Silence pooled after that, the kind that holds a lesson and the smell of old leather. Colonel Price moved closer, hands behind his back. "Mr. Palmer," he said, with the terse courtesy of someone who had to balance protocol and people, "we need verification. We have to log the chain of custody, check registry for any prototypes, confirm clearance." Palmer offered his credentials again. His access issued an endpoint in a ledger. Rows in a database would now carry the day forward. Price's staff worked the phones like a well-rehearsed engine, moving across nodes. Base records, a museum registrar who kept artifacts like memories in drawers, an operations desk that jotted the name Mark V down and then looked up old personnel files. Evans fidgeted. He had not yet been spoken to by a brigadier general. He had not yet been scolded in front of his men by anyone who mattered. The air around him thickened with the sensation of impending accountability. It had a physicality to it that young people often mistake for theatricality. Gunny Miller stepped away and pulled him by an elbow until they were out of earshot. Her tone when she spoke to him was low but absolute. "You embarrassed a man who came out to remember," she said. "You embarrassed yourself. Fix it. Learn why that's wrong. You will write an essay for range safety on institutional memory. You will do a day in the museum cleaning and inventorying artifacts. You will stop making other people's pain into spectacle." Evans flushed and then paled. Pride resisted. The floor opened beneath it. "Yes, ma'am," he muttered. The words tasted like a conviction that had been forced upon him and like relief. There was a weight to sorrow that could, if handled, become ballast. While administrative boxes were checked and the convoy idled like a fleet of anchored thoughts, small things moved in the margins. Palmer drifted to the low berm with his rifle and sat down where the sight lines stretched long. He breathed in, the thin desert air tasting of metal and old soap. A young corporal from another shift came up and offered him a bottle of water with the awkward politeness of youth meeting seniority. Alan accepted, thumbed the bottle, and nodded. The boy's hands trembled a little when he turned to leave. The tremor was not all nerves. It was respect, awkward and unfamiliar. The phone calls eventually carried a flag from a registrar in the base museum. The Mark V was logged, but its history was not entirely formalized. The record had been assembled from scrap, notes in the margin of another log, a photograph with a date scrawled on the back, a typed letter from a colleague who had since retired. That was all the base had relied upon. It was enough to flag the rifle as historically significant,
It was not enough to explain away the chorus of disrespect it had raised. Between confirmations, Palmer allowed himself a patchwork of memory. There was the pilot, small, quick to laugh, who died before he could become more than a footnote in man's private reckonings. There were nights in oily hangars, the whine of machinery that sounded like conversation, and the silence afterward when men counted the hours carefully, like keeping compass headings. Palmer did not mention names. The men who had served with him were not tokens for the present. They were human, complicated, absent in ways that could not be made whole by ceremony alone. Gradually, the base's attention shifted into procedure. Colonel Price requested a formal review, a small panel to sort whether the rifle might be loaned to the museum display. Brigadier General Marcus suggested a different tack. If the artifact had cultural value, especially one that touched on the lives it had saved, then its narrative was not properly told by a paper trail. It needed voices. It needed living witnesses. "Bring him to the administrative compound," she said. "Let him tell his story to the trainees. Let them hear it straight." Evan's throat made a sound that might have been resistance. "We can put him in the chute," he muttered under his breath. "Make it a lecture. Could be boring." Marcus's head tipped. "Or you can listen, Corporal. You might find it does you good." That was the point where the story, which had been a local quarrel, folded back upon itself and turned into doctrine. The brigadier's convoy folded up again and moved like a tide toward the administrative hall. Inside, in a room paneled with framed photos and flags that reached the ceiling, the group took their places. Marines sat with knees squared. The air conditioning made a small, persistent sound like a machine trying to think. Palmer stood in front of them with the orange rifle on the table.
He spoke without theatrics and without much embellishment. He told fragments, snapshots of the kind of life that does not translate well into accolades. He spoke about the engineer who made the stock so it fit a hand like it had been carved for a particular owner. He spoke of the night when the convoy had been pinned down, how someone in the scrub had been lost until his team found him, signaling with something bright in the plane. He spoke, when it was necessary, through a voice that was not gone but had been spent in other directions. The room was quiet in a way that pulled at the ribs. The Marines who had laughed felt each sentence like a small cold. Evans watched him and felt something constrict in his chest that he didn't have a name for. He had thought heroism was loud and wanton and public. He had thought bravery meant standing up and being seen. Palmer's words made him see something else, the stubborn, unglamorous work of being present, of keeping tools where they might be needed, of honoring the people who did not always get photos on command. Afterwards, Marcus spoke briefly, with the kind of economy of language that made it clear where she stood. "We make a ritual of heroes," she said, "and we forget that heroes often want nothing but to be left with their living names. This hand," she gestured to Palmer's, "has sustained more than a story. It has kept people alive. We will see to it that this rifle's place, whether in a field case or on a wall, carries the whole context. But the immediate lesson is for all of you. Respect is not ceremonial. It's practical. It's owed." There were administrative consequences that did not look like punishment. Evans found part of his remediation in the museum. He would clean exhibits, catalog items, and write a reflective essay on institutional memory. Miller saw to it that the essay was not an exercise in humiliation, but a prompt for growth. The brigadier instituted a seminar on veterans' narratives, not as an empty box to check, but as a recurring obligation. The Marines were not docked pay. They were sent into a kind of apprenticeship with their past. Evans did not like the idea at first. The museum smelled of dust and antiseptic polish, the smell of things kept safe from weather and easy forgetting. On his first day, he wore the gray gloves of the registrar and learned the slow, precise way a frame was handled. He learned the index system, the kind of small, boring reverence that preserves a face in a photograph for another generation to read. Under the hum of the lights, he found himself lingering on a small plaque about a pilot whose face was ordinary and whose record had been thin.
He read until the words lost their edges and became a person. The day he brought his essay to Gunny Miller, it was shorter than expected, but it was honest. "I learned that memory is an active thing," he said. "It's not just what you keep, it's what you show. I figured I could laugh, put up a shield." But it hurt people who needed recognition to be more than their absence. Miller folded the sheet and pinned it to a bulletin board that had the practical purpose of reminding men to keep up on obligations. She pinned his name next to a list of tasks. "Do this work right," she said. "Do it like you mean it." The ripples of that morning stretched beyond the immediate circle. The base organized a small event where the rifle would be demonstrated, not as an advertisement for skill, but as a lesson in the dignity of craft. Marcus insisted it be done plainly. A short walk to the long line of targets, a small crowd gathered with a folding chair, and the smell of sunscreen. Photographers' lenses were kept at a respectful distance. The ceremony would not be spectacle. On the day of the demonstration, the sun lay low and forgiving, the earth warm without being cruel. The air smelled like citrus sunscreen and the faint edge of gun oil. Men who had once laughed watched with faces turned soft. The crowd gathered into a silence that those who had known many quiet things called reverent. Palmer walked to the firing line with the orange rifle cradled. He did not wear a medal, he wore the same jacket as before. The stock caught the light and threw it back like a small, stubborn signal. He set the butt to his shoulder with the easy muscle memory of someone who had practiced the motion until it was as natural as breathing. He exhaled slowly, sighting along the barrel. The world shrank to a fine line of earth and target. His finger did not twitch in arrogant flourish. It moved with the deliberation of someone who trusted his craft more than his reputation. The shot cracked sharp and clean. It was not eloquent, it was a practical punctuation. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The echo rolled back across the range until the sky seemed to hold it. Then the target registered the hit. A small, precise mark, impossible only to those who measured possibility in bravado and not in hours of patient repetition. The crowd made a single collective sound, the gasp like a held breath finally released. Evans felt something in his chest unclench. For a moment he was a boy again, the kind of boy who wanted to stay small in order to avoid the risks of being wrong. Now he felt something else, a small, hot humility. He had been shown that competence is patient and that experience is not something to scoff at. Palmer lowered the rifle and looked across the crowd. His face was readable now in a way it had not been at the start, not younger but clarified. He did not look for applause. He waited only to be noticed, to have his story acknowledged in a way that made the past not into a parade but into a part of present duty. Evans stepped forward, shoulders finally squared by something other than swagger. He extended a hand that trembled like a leaf. "Corporal," Palmer said, taking the hand with a grip that was firm but not crushing, "you seem to be learning." "I am, sir," Evans said. His voice was steady now, but softer. "I'm sorry for what I said, for how I acted. I didn't know." Palmer's mouth tipped into an expression that might have been a smile had it arrived without the patience of years. "Then don't do it again," he said. "Learn to look first. Keep it that way." There were no grand reconciliations, no declarations that the world had been remade. There was instead the careful unpacking of responsibility and the slow realignment of what mattered. The institution, that slow, sometimes clumsy thing meant to hold memory, made itself better by small acts. A seminar that met on schedule, a museum that welcomed visitors, a young corporal who wrote essays and did the careful work of cataloging. The brigadier's decision to fold the rifle's story into training meant that new men who came to the regime would be reminded not only of tactics and forms, but of humility and respect. In the flare of the demonstration, the orange rifle regained its quiet dignity. It sat now in a place where it could be seen by those who walked the base museum's narrow corridors, with a small plaque that told only enough. In the months after, recruits would pause at the display, read the few words, and move on with a small, private impression lodged in them. That was the point. Memory preserved, in the modest, not mounted as a trophy. Palmer returned to his routines. He visited the range intermittently, sometimes bringing a thermos of coffee for Gunny Miller, who accepted it like a treaty. Once, in the low light of an evening shift, he sat with Evans and spoke about small things: how to oil a hinge, the way the sun marks leather, how to temper impatience into responsibility. He did not absolve the past. He taught how to live with it. Evans learned more than technicalities. He learned the shape of a mistake and how to repair it. He learned that mocking another man's memory didn't make him grand, it made him small. He wrote an essay that the command kept, not as a public shaming, but as a quiet measure of growth. He read it to a small circle of Marines at the next seminar, and for the first time, the room seemed to match the words they spoke. The base museum did not become a shrine to one man, and the brigade did not build a statue in the parking lot. What changed was quieter, policies that included the living testimony of veterans, small daily practices that nudged young men toward humility, an institutional memory that accepted correction as a means of improvement. The brigadier's orders were not vindictive. They were about the continuity of honor. Months later, on a day when dust lay thin and the light fell like patience, Evans found himself turning a small, crinkled photograph in his hands. It had been in a file he had cataloged. Someone had written a single line on the back, a name and a date. He slid the photo into a folder marked with a neat hand, and then spoke into the quiet.
"Thank you," he said, "not to any single person, but to the habit of remembering." Palmer, when asked about it in the years that followed, would only smile and say that he had been lucky to do his part. He never asked for the center of a story. He lived the lesson. That dignity is often a quiet thing, carried in the way one handles an object, the way one speaks of the absent, the way one accepts a young man's apology and then helps him build better habits. And when Marines laughed now, years after that first morning at Echo Range, their laughter had the shape of different contours. They laughed at jokes that were meant to land with the sound of easing tension, not the jagged edge of derision. When recruits walked past the orange rifle in the museum, they read the plaque and their shoulders eased, or tightened accordingly. The rifle remained an odd island in the sun, bright, incongruous, but no longer a thing to mock. It was a marker of a life threaded into a chain, of how a tool can carry memory, and how memory can, when tended, change men. If this moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories that honor those who served. Help keep their memories from fading. Tell someone today what you've learned.